You know, I was looking on YouTube and I was looking around and I thought to myself, how come I never saw certain things on YouTube? Or how come I never saw, like specific videos on specific things?
No dodging this shot. How was that?
Nice shot. Hold position. I'll head over for support.
Federation officer. I will not.
Awaiting orders.
They're onto you.
You're being targeted.
Prepare yourself.
Target down.
All allies have been taken out.
Okay, moving out. There they are.
I'm looking forward to hearing good news.
Right there.
Timeline says that the following.
They're good.
We need you to handle the situation, Squad.
Knowing in the story, looking at the game and seeing its story and how it unfolds, we know that in Valkyria Chronicles 1 and 4, they start with the European Wars, which everyone already knows that it's kind of similar. If you think about it, it's similar to like the First and Second World War. However, though, the thing is, they don't have a concept of planes. If you didn't know that, yes, for some reason, their advanced society does not know the idea of planes. But it makes sense though, because this is a fiction game. This game is purely fiction.
You smell that? Reminds me of home.
Now,
That was wonderful.
if you think about it,
Well done.
this game is truly fiction. But remember, it's not just because it's fiction, it's also because it has some sort of like real kind of story implications of its timeline and how it works.
Leave it to me.
So let's start with the first 28 going from the beginning, then we'll get to the point of where the whole European War begins. So the story begins in 0 EC, which is basically the beginning, almost. Or who knows what it could stand for. 0 EC, we're not entirely sure what they mean by EC. It could mean like evangelicals or something. I don't know. Some people speculate it's like
Call for support
before.
whenever you
Some people speculate it could be BCE, or it could be something of this sort of like
This is everything I've got. Come on. Leave it to me. This one's a Riley Miller special.
I'm sorry, everyone. I know it's freezing out there.
Don't worry.
war in the Valkyria Chronicles timeline. Now, no one entirely is sure for or what this could mean. So, in Zero EC, the Darsans, which are considered a subclass of human, are considered subhuman for some reason, even though Darsans are human. Darsans were considered a different race in the Valkyria Chronicles timeline. No one knows why or how the Darsans became to be. We seem to assume that the Darsans and the normal humans were having a civil war over something, and no one knows what it was about, or some sort of like
Come on.
pre sort of war, or to fighting each other. Now, looking at it says that the Darsans. Now the Darsans, we don't know exactly, but if we were to listen to Rosetta's lines if you were to play the extra stories, Rosetta mentions how the Darsans were fighting for equal rights, kind of like how in our modern society there was black people fighting for their rights not too long ago. She mentions that. But here's the thing: no one knows why they were fighting for their rights. What was the issue of their rights? Were their rights being taken away? Were their rights being subvert? Like, how do you say it? Like, were their rights being taken away? Were their rights being ostracized in a way? No one knows for sure, but we do know that the Darsans were subdued and Europa was conquered by the Valkyr, which had something to do with the Valkyr taking over Europa, which is like, I guess you could say, the beta continent of Europe. It's kind of like Europe, but it's different.
Easy.
You could say it's like Europe, but it's very different. So no one knows exactly entirely sure what it could mean. But we do know that somewhere around in the time, weapons were being developed to a weird, unorthodox scale. They were being researched and developed to a weird scale. So something tells me so the timeline would say that before Zero EC there was probably something in place. No one knows for sure, because I don't know if anyone knows, but there's a lot of different things that can explain, the whole, this being the different century. This is considering the fact that they are technically in, like, when we go to Valkyria Chronicles 4, their timeline is like in the 20th century. However, though, it's kind of different because it's 10 years off World War II. It's at least maybe like 6 or 5 years off World War II, or when it first initially started.
I got this.
So we're going through this. So circa 200 EC, the nation of Gallia is formed and Castle Rangriz is built and begins to rule the surrounding areas. So basically, something tells me that this all started out because of, they formed their castles. So something tells me this had to have been before, or something like that.
You sure?
Watch my back.
This way?
So we're not entirely sure. But what I do know is this. Something tells me that around 200 EC, this has to do with something. This probably has to do with, possibly, if I'm not mistaken,
Your own damn fault.
it probably had something to do with feudalism. And I'm assuming it was feudal at the time when they were first starting out in 200 EC. So something tells me in 200 EC, they started a time of feudalism. Now, that could explain a lot of things. We don't exactly know what they were doing in this time because it says that their time was already during the feudal era. They were already in basically feudalism era, where there was lords and ladies, castles galore, people ruling the surrounding areas, the nobility forming as a class of its own. Now, that's something.
We're taking casualties.
So now we get to the difficult part, where time goes on.
Acknowledge. Hailing rescue party. Deploy at once.
Chapter 2. The Enlightenment era in Valkyria and Europa itself. Now we get on to the more advanced timelines. We basically go into circa 1500s EC, which as we know in our timeline, 1500s was a time of great enlightenment. Was close to, well, it hadn't been the Enlightenment just yet. Our Enlightenment didn't take place until the 1700s, and we didn't know whether to consider the kings or queens were fit to rule because of nobility, of them being the nobility and them having the right to rule. That stuff.
Stay cool. Ready to go. You smell that? Reminds me of home. Understood.
Watch out! They're onto you! The enemy has begun their counterattack.
Is that all?
I'll be trained to safe return.
And there was a feudal infighting between two houses. However, though, House Rangriz was uh, the original house was in a very difficult situation against House Gassanari. House Gassanaro battled over House Rangriz over control of Gallia, but because the civil population wasn't too happy about that, it failed because of the lack of popular support.
Back home are all right.
Which made sense because why would you support a different house that was not supposed to rule, that was basically ruling over that, or were trying to fight the other house? You know, it's kind of like with the whole feudal thing again. You got to think about it. It's about the whole feudalism thing again. However, though, if you also think about it,
You're being targeted.
there was also the issue of enlightenment, where people were saying, "Hey, we think that this isn't right," and they weren't kidding. This wasn't right at all. What they were doing with the house Gassanal were doing, they were trying to take over a standing house which had full support of its ruling, and to basically kind of like a civil war stance, but not really. Now we move on to circa 1720s, or as we know it as the actual era of Enlightenment. And the province of Lancel decided to open a royal military academy to train people in military tactics and warfare. Which Lancel, if you were to look at the map of Gallia, is a actual province. Now we look at now we look at the timeline, and the timeline also points out as time went forward, there was also distinctive a distinctive change in the time. Now we get to the interesting part of the timeline change. In the late 1700s, for most of Europa and abroad, the Industrial Revolution occurs. Now, if you may be thinking late 1700s, but didn't the Industrial Revolution take place in the 1830s? Well, see, that's where you didn't read correctly. I said late 1700s. Basically, it was cutting close to the 1800s. However, though, you aren't far off from the truth there. Their Industrial Revolution occurred a little earlier than ours, or it occurred a little similar to ours. Let me explain. Ours came about when the invention of the steam engine came around in 1720s, which was invented by a man who none other would be known as. Hold on. Hold on. James Watt. James Watt would be the original inventor of the steam engine. However, though, these guys had a different source of power. Yes, they had the Industrial Revolution, but their form of power was different. Their power came from a source known as Ragnarite. Ragnarite was their form of power, basically the all source of power to power things like lamp. Well, it's kind of like fuel and oil. Oil powers basically everything from lamps, telecoms, telegraph wires, steam, and trains, and all that. It powers everything, kind of like similar to coal or oil. But in their timeline, it is a scarce material of resource. Ragnarite is considered a rare material, even though it's considered to many to be, as in turn as it would be known as, a fuel source, or as a... Well, because here's the thing, Ragnarite comes in many forms. It can be used as a medical healing device. It can be used as a way to power certain things like vehicles, such as tanks, planes. Well, not planes, because again, they didn't invent planes, but moving on. Basically, Ragnarite was used for everything. Kind of like how it's like coal for everything else. Now, we get onto the late 1700s to explain. We're going back to the late 1700s to explain what happened during the Industrial Revolution for the European continent. The East European Imperial Alliance, however, was more than just a treaty. It was an alliance formed in the East European nations. They all joined together to form this international alliance because they believed in a sort of, well, let's just say their beliefs were like a mix of communism and fascism. Kind of like a sort of, intermixed ideas of conservatism. They were a large conservative part, with their nation fitting the center, or which I guess we're gonna call I guess you could call it the authoritarian version of a sort of like Soviet Union, which it kind of was like that. It was a sort of like fanatic, hugely conservative fascist ideas. They do mention fascist ideas because the reason why I say fascist is because there were times that Minerva mentioned them as fascist. and some of the commanders mentioned their country being a whole belief of fascist ideals or conservative fascist ideals, which no one quite observantly knows why or how they came up with this idea that their ideas were fascist, which confuses me at first because I never understood, wait, why were they considered fascist? So I guess you could say that
Too easy.
fascism was a thing. And it formed way before. And if you're thinking that there was a Mussolini in their timeline, you're probably wrong. There was probably not.
You smell that?
Because yes, we all know that Mussolini was basically the man who founded fascism and it made it a thing. But we know for sure that fascism somehow existed and it was there to stay. And somehow their emperor approved of this sort of thing. Sounds a little similar to Japan, how Japan's military took over the country. Now, you might be thinking, wait, this does sound kind of similar to Japan. And you'd be right. Because Japan at the time had a sort of similar issue going on back in the early 1920s, 30s, where their military was basically going on their own, wasting valuable nation resources to basically form their own militaristic society and having Japan be formed around it. Which you may ask yourself, that's weird. However, though, this Industrial Revolution was different. Like America and some other nations, popular uprisings began to rise, kind of like a sort of, France kind of thing. It did it sort of like a France thing. Which a lot of people would say, hey, that's a little similar to what France did. And you'd be right. Because France did something similar to this. And so France itself did something similar to what those basically they basically did something similar to what France did. Revolution, popular uprisings, all that jazz. And so with that, they went ahead and formed democratic republics. Yes, you heard me right. Democracy. Fun. So once they formed those democratic republics, they saw that the empire was basically a threat to their democracy, to the democratic ideals and the democratic processes of their countries. However, though, some would see that this was the case. However, they didn't know if it was going to be the case with the countries surrounding them. And nobody knows if this was going to be the norm or the not norm of it all. However, though, following up with the formation of these democratic republics, with the empire becoming a looming threat, these republics took on the Mutual Defense Agreement Treaty, or formerly known as you guessed it, the Atlantic Federation.
No hard feelings.
That was wonderful.
So, with this in mind, this all culminates to it being something of important interests.
I don't mind running around.
So, you're probably wondering, now hold on a minute. If they fought for independence of democracy, wouldn't they have taken out the imperial threat by then? Well, no, because as democracies are, they don't want to start a fight unless it's, again, we all know how democracies work in modern times. Democracies tend to follow a policy of trying to form peace with other nations. Yet, if these nations, Yet if the nation itself dares attack it for some unnecessary and unwise reason of aggression, or if there is a aggression against a democratic nation, then the democratic nation has the right to defend itself, to uphold an army, to make sure that that army defends the nation. Now, by this democratic army defending the nation, you not only have a pretext as to how, but you also have a pretext as to why. But most democratic nations go by the lessons of history nowadays. Like specifically right now, which I will not get into because right now current politics and everything is just a big old mess. So, let's discuss this. Let's get back to discussing this. Now, we go to circa 1800s EC, where the Empire invades Gallia and the king renounces his crown. Why is this? Well, because the Empire unfortunately wanted to expand its territory at that time. The Empire, with its great nations aligned and all peacefully absorbed, quote-unquote, with the Empire's ambitions, the Empire wanted to, let's say, expand its territories, to expand its conservative yet sort of fascist communist ideals. Now, nobody likes fascism. I know that there are a lot of people who would say, but fascism is wrong. No, we shouldn't let fascism take over. Fascism is bad.
Easy.
Because fascism is not a good ideology, nor is it a very fun one at best. Because what it implies the principle of is, as we all know what fascism is the national unity through either racial politics or possible right-winged narratives. That's what I would consider the simplest definition of fascism I can give without hopefully not getting anyone angry. Because I may be a middle ground man, but I sure as hell ain't no fascist. Because trust me, I would point to that next guy, hey buddy, you would probably shouldn't do that. So as it goes, the war, so Gallia falls, and the Archduke. So, hold on. I'm sorry if I sound like I'm pausing a lot. It's because it's my first time doing this. So, the Empire invades Gallia, and the king renounced his crown, but now ruling over Gallia as an Archduke of an autonomous region of the Empire. Now, you may be wondering, why? Well, because Gallia hadn't pursued its neutral foreign policy yet, like Belgium or the Netherlands did in our timeline. We know for a fact that this sort of neutrality didn't come yet until then. Now, why has neutrality not come then? Because neutrality hadn't existed yet for some nations. Well, some existed for a neutral peace, but some didn't know if neutrality was the right place for it.
Don't fall for their traps.
A true display of skill.
So now you may be wondering, what could be the consideration of
Damn you. I won't give up.
So now we go down to where they mention Galius War of Independence. Now, Gallia's War of Independence is pretty straightforward. The Galian people did not want to surrender, nor did they want to ever fight.
I can't keep
Gallia took this invasion as a sort of far cry call to take up arms against their invaders and push them back.
I don't mind running around.
And so they did. So Gallia decided to fight back, and Gallia made sure that the invaders paid the price hard. So Galian War of Independence began, and in the same year,
We're getting you out.
or
You're
so,
gonna be okay.
or I guess in that sort of way, yes. So when Gallia finally pushed the enemy Archduke, so the Archduke pushes for freedom from the Empire and succeeds, which leads to the Gallian and people of freedom and happiness. Now Gallia as the Principality of Gallia now, well, Gallia lost its national status as a nation and became a principality instead for some reasons. And it was hard for Gallia to feel that they lost that territory. That territory was lost for Gallia. Gallia lost its territory, and because of it, they only were able to become a principality at this point. But it was not over yet. For sooner or later, things would change. Chapter 3. The Post-Industrial Revolution, 1900s. Now, we go into the timeline of things changing. The 1900s, there was a lot of things to go over in the 1900s here. The 1900s were truly a weird time, I would say. Now, if we were to describe what the 1900s were truly like, it was a sort of wave of chaos. So the crown prince of the empire, which we do not know the name of, however, though, the emperor, who was at this point in time probably really old, who didn't want to be in his crown and stay crowned as the emperor anymore because he was probably old as hell. But because his son, the Archduke, was assassinated, he demanded that there would be compensation. However, though, because of it not happening, he did not ask for compensation, and he just outright declared war on all the nations because of his son being assassinated to some liberal nationalist who wanted freedom. Now, the First European War begins, and it's not too long that the kingdom of Freihalt is conquered by the Empire. The Empire conquers this kingdom, and it is stuck, being conquered. However, though, in circa 1915, 15 years later, the war would end. This took longer than the actual First World War. The First World War started in 1914 and didn't end until it didn't officially end until 1919. So you could say that the First European War lasted much longer than the second, or the second one was probably shorter, but the first one definitely lasted longer than our First World War. Surely enough. So now we get to the interesting parts of the story, where in 1923 things would change. See, Riley's father, who was Albert Miller, created something interesting. He made Ragnarite a more refined. He made a refining process for Ragnarite, and it boomed. The city of Hoffen reported that their power grids have never ran more smoother, and considered the Miller company was the best electric company, and it was even subsidized by the Archduke himself as to keep it running, to keep the mines open, as to keep Ragnarite a sufficient power source. However, though, this would not be the same as one Heinrich Belgar of the Empire's research and development team went in himself, and he wanted this technology. He wanted this technology to personally make it his and to turn it as a weapon to make Valkyras. And Valkyras haven't been heard since Zero EC, and some speculated that this could be a revival for the Empire. Some even suggested that this could even make the Empire stronger, and Belgar even convinced the Emperor himself that they should prepare defenses to to they should prepare plans to integrate, but not only integrate, but to also bring Galia into the fold of its ideas, and to hopefully maybe bring it into the idea of, you know, of its whole, conquering Europa finally. And this is where things get tricky.
Advancing.
Like, really tricky.
Right there.
And when we say tricky, I mean like this stuff gets really confusing as heck.
Come in, Centurion. Requesting fire support.
So,
Sending
the Miller
coordinates
Company in Hoffen was founded by Riley's father, Albert Miller, or as he was nicknamed by Heinrich Belgar, Al, who was apparently his so-and-so partner and friend, as to be said. But we all know that's not true. He was using him to basically get information, to literally scoop out any idea of, to maybe get any ideas out of him. Like, maybe to find any way he can weaponize Ragnarite. And he wanted to weaponize it. He wanted to turn it into a weapon. But Belgar would never knew the consequences that would come about. Belgar would never know the consequences that would be raised if he was to do this kind of evil, immoral thing. He would never know the consequences that would lead up to him, to him in himself becoming the one thing that Al didn't want to see happen. He didn't want it to be used for military purposes, nor did he want the one thing that Belgar refused, that Al refused to let happen, and that was to see Ragnarite turned into a weapon. It boiled in his blood that he didn't want to see Ragnarite turned into a weapon. He didn't want it to. But unfortunately, Belgar made him think otherwise. Belgar made him say, hey, if we turn this into this, we can become rich. We could enrich ourselves. He was trying to lure Al Miller into doing this stuff. But he knew smart. Al was way too smart for this to... Al was way smarter than this. Al knew that he didn't want to let something like this happen. So he said no. He told Belgar no. And Belgar was furious, but he passed it off, saying, "Alright, your loss, Al, old friend." Al didn't want to hear it from him, but it was until then in that same year that the Miller Company in Hoffen burned down because Belgar led a detachment of Imperial soldiers leading leading to that company to burn it down and take Al's research. However, though, he left Al to die in the fire that Belgar created to seal his research. Al tried to stop him, but it wasn't enough. And so then Belgar left an impression on Riley Miller and young Claude. When Riley saw it go down, Riley was outside and seeing that her father's company was burning down. However, though, Riley could not go in as Claude stopped her from going in. Claude knew that the fire was dangerous. Claude knew what was dangerous about this. He didn't want Riley to die in that fire. And so, Riley lost her mother, her sister, and her father, all lost to the fire as Riley was watching, and Claude stopped her from going in because Claude knew he didn't want her to die. And this would become important because this would later affect Riley growing up, because Riley was raised alone after that incident. She was raised by her uncle and aunt after the incident, but that was it. No one knew what would happen then. No one knew what would happen to Riley's mother and father.
This is an order. Get patched up. Get back in the.
We don't truly know what happened, but we do know that they did mention that they did burn up.
I got this.
So, in 1930, things would change. However, though, the Empire wanted things to change. The Empire wanted to continue its plans as done.
Never lose.
The Empire attempted to pressure Gallia into joining. However, though, the pressure would not work. Gallia would remain neutral.
Being targeted.
Damn it.
Gallia would said and kept their promise. They would remain neutral to keep away from evils such as the Empire. The Empire knew that Gallia would say no, and someday Gallia would be in the forefront of attack once more. No one knew how or when, but it was coming sooner or later, and soon it would come to be.
I'll handle the rest, okay?
And soon it would become the time where soon in 1931 the Imperial artillery shells and lands in Hoppen, causing fires and killing many. The Galian government's lackluster response causes many to enlist with the Federation's army. Now, we know at this time the Federation didn't know that this was happening, but when they got wind of it, the Federation got mad, super mad, that they attacked a neutral little nation, a principality nation. And this was, of course, let's just say bad. How bad? Well, despite the fact that it caused fires and killed civilians, we'll call this a war crime. Now, yes, this was technically a war crime because this was during a time of peace. And by shelling a nation without warning the civilians to evacuate, they shelled innocent people, which made no sense because why would you shell innocent people? I'm assuming to scare them into submission, but it didn't work. They never were scared into submission. In 1933, the testing of Chimera and Silvaria began, and they tested the strength of these Valkyria As
When you're beyond help.
and so therefore we knew that this was gonna come. We knew that these people these people of great skill and power would know that this was coming. The Federation grant welcomed these people enlisting with open arms, knowing that the Empire was an evil to be contested. This could not be ignored. The Federation had to step up. It had to step up as a democracy to stand against the tyranny of fascism. If they didn't, then all of democracy and the ideas of it, with the land itself, would be gone. It would not be sunshine and rainbows from here on out. So, as it's set, as we look into May 1934 EC, Squad E is formed. Squad E gets formed out of a few people known into it. There's Kai, Raz, and then there's the commanding officer of it all, Claude Wallace. The great Claude Wallace would be commanding Squad E. Now, we know that Squad E was very famous in the game. We all know what Squad E is. We all know who Squad E really is. We all know that this is interesting and how it gets interesting to itself. Now, we know that this takes place in Valkyria Chronicles 4. So, if we look into the timeline, we'll know that. Now, we're going to skip a little bit of the timeline and go into important details. Now, we know that at some point Galia is trying to recruit an army. So, we look into this. In the timeline since of July 23rd, 1935 EC, the July/Midsummer incident occurs, where the Federation secretly attempts to abduct Princess Cordelia and take control of Galia. And obviously, this attempt is foiled by Squad 7. Now, you're probably wondering, wait, why did the Federation attempt to abduct a princess to take control of Galia? Well, it's because they wanted to secure Galia, or they wanted to use Galia as a sort of, they wanted to use the princess as leverage to the Archduke, saying to the ambassador, saying, hey, we have the princess, we want you to join the Federation. And this was where Claude Wallace got the message of taking care of personal matters by the Archduke/ambassador or governor, who didn't want to do it. Now, in March 15th of 1935, the Eastern European Alliance begins its invasion of the Principality of Gallia, starting with a small border town of Brule and the border fortress of Ghirlando, in order to gain access to its vast riches of Ragnarite, which is the important stuff. However, though, Squad 7, in with Alicia and Welkin Gunther, help lead the Brule town watch to repel the Imperial scouting forces, and the town's civilians evacuate. But Brule falls at the end of the day. However, though, Fort Crest at this time was also captured by the Federation through the efforts of Squad E, meaning that this wasn't a full loss. However, though, things would get worse. Then the Empire began, bringing the Imperial invasion of Gallia to an end, which means now the Gallia has secured peace. And because Gallia secured peace, now that Gallia has secured peace, it no longer is subject to enemy enemy fighting,
Follow
or
my
no,
lead.
they managed to sign a
I
peace
got
deal.
this. My turn.
Which is pretty good because I almost thought for a second that they wouldn't
Preparations
secure
complete.
peace. Which makes sense, but also you have to admit, these people really struggled to secure peace.
This is our deadliest enemy yet. So keep your guard
And
up.
so
Squad
now
2,
we look
move out.
now we look at the further timeline, and we know that this is unbelievable. Chapter 4. The timeline secures forward. October 25th, 1935, an armistice is signed between Gallia and the Empire. Cordelia confesses her Darsan heritage to the public. The Nameless is disbanded. And October 31st, 1935, on Halloween, Cordelia becomes the Archduchess of Gallia, which is confusing because they did say the Darsans were bad, but she did confess her Darsan heritage to the public, so I guess that kind of gives her credit. Now, winter of 1935 and 36 becomes difficult because this is around, I guess you could say, December, January, the new year. Squad E raids, and so as we all know, in Valkyria 4, Squad E raids Imperial supply base before rendezvous with the 32nd Armored Ranger Corps. Though the latter suffers heavy casualties from an Augsburg ambush, especially squads D and F. Now we already know what happens to D and F. D and F were annihilated. They were gone. Squad D and F were just completely destroyed. And Minerva, seeing that Squad E barely pulls up in this heat of the moment, is furious at him. Now we go to the end of the war, which is in January of 1936. Now, in December of 1935, prior to this peace, terrorist activities targeting Darsans in Gallia begins. This continues until the Galian Revolutionary Army is officially formed in 1936, which allows Gallia to finally form a peacekeeping force to be reckoned with. But in April 24th of 1936, Southern Gallia is plagued with terrorist activity by an organization group of anti-Darsan activists. But in May of 1936 of that same year, Lanzo Royal Military Academy is tasked with maintaining peace in southern Gallia. But in June of 1936, Lanzo Royal Military Academy begins taking counterterrorism measures. And also that same year of 1936 of September, Gilbert Gassanaro forms the Galian Revolutionary Army again. They quickly gain control of much of southern Gallia. Lanzo's special mission ends in a failure, however, as to contain the terrorist threat, as you know, terrorists are not easily to keep down. But in January of 1937, Avon Hardens receives news from Hubert Brixen that his brother Leon Hardens had passed away. The cause of his death could not be disclosed due to national security. Minutes later, rebels from the Galian Revolutionary Army attacked the village of Elver. However, the GRA restates their intentions and demands that the Princess of Gallia steps down. However, though, this leads to complications. Now, in May of 1937 of that same year, GRA forces nearly wipe out the Darsans settled in the D'Alba Mountains. But in June of 1937, the GRA launches an official offensive into central Gallia, targeting Uel and Melver. Now, in 1937 of July, Loyalist forces, with the help of Class G, fend off the GRA attack on Uel through Melver and is captured, the GRA would also retreat to the south. This is where some would consider the Civil War to have begun. Now, the GRA launches an attack on Lancel during the Feast of All Spirits and effectively cripples the Academy's ability to respond militarily. Taking advantage of this, the rebels launch another offensive to the north. And August 22nd of 1937, Rangriz and the Archduchess is captured by the Galian Revolutionary Army. In September of 1937, Baldrin Assanar kills his father and assumes control all in command of the GRA. However, though on November 7th through the 10th, 3 days go on. The Galian army launches Operation Alabaster Gale and successfully recaptures Rangriz. Mid-November 1937. The main rebel force retreats to Anthold. This signals the final end to the Civil War, and nearing the end, the Loyalist forces gather multiple men and women as conscripts. Some even are put into military. Some go into military factories where they cannot serve. Some even go into production. Some even do the littlest they can to help the military out. In December 20th, 1937, Class G defeats and kills Baldrin Gassanaro, which effectively ruins the coordination of the rebel army. And on December 21st, 1937, Archduchess Cordelia de Rangriz calls for an immediate surrender of all remaining rebel forces, bringing the Galian Civil War to its immediate and ultimate end, the lives of which do not say how or why the war ended. The war ended on a very fractured peace. Many Darsons died for these fighting men and women. No one will know how the war came to its end. No one will know the story of it all. But all is for sure that the wars that were brought before it, the peace that was brought before it, may no longer be a war anymore, but to also see the end of this war. So, with that end, we know how this story begins, how it ends, and how things became what they were. The war brought together and separated people. Many have died for the war. Many have died trying to fight this war. And it was truly difficult. The Atlantic Federation knew that this would be a difficult